Renegade, Chapter 21. Bullets from snipers across the street pelted the Humvee as Pike hauled himself into the back of the vehicle. He slung the M4A1 over his shoulder and tucked in behind the big 50 cal machine gun. More rounds flattened against the defensive shroud that flared around the weapon. Under his weight, the deck listed sideways on the shredded tires as he moved. After checking the belt feed and finding nothing amiss, Pike settled in behind the big gun. As he spun the muzzle around and towards the buildings on the other side of the street, a rocket struck the street only a few feet from him. Broken rock beat against the Humvee, shaking it slightly as smaller debris bounced from Pike's armor and stung his face and hands. Pike opened fire and felt the heavy machine gun jerking and rising, climbing from the muzzle velocity. He corrected the gun's natural upward inclination and stitched a jagged line across the buildings where the Al-Qaeda snipers lay in hiding. Spent cartridges ejected out of the gun like brass rain. The 50 cal round had been designed as a tank buster, a solid core capable of penetrating armor and going on to kill targets within a steel-clad vehicle. Rounds did their job now, chopping through wood, punching page 188 through stone, and destroying the enemy combatants on the other side. Pike didn't let up till the belt had nearly cycled through. Ears ringing from the baso explosions, sweat running down his face and neck, Pike abandoned the machine gun only long enough to grab the next ammunition belt from the ammo box and connect it to the last. Then he was back at the gun, scouting for whatever survivors might still be in their posts. "Pike, hold your fire." Heath Bridger's voice was sharp, but he was in control. "Roger that. Holding fire, but I'm locked and loaded." Pike sat sweltering behind the machine gun. He kept watch anxiously as the Marines debarked from the Humvees and spread out to contain the situation. As Heath jogged forward, he managed the anxiousness that flooded through him when he thought about the danger he'd placed Becca in. It had been his choice to have her patrol in this area, but she wouldn't have wanted him protecting her. That would have brought her out her ire. He was sure of that. Let it go. When she's out there, she's a Marine. If you treat her any different, even for a second, you're doing her and yourself a disservice, and you won't be a fit to command these Marines. But thinking of her as one of the other Marines was hard. Thinking of female Marines as regular squad mates was difficult to begin with. His first inclination was protect her. Most male Marines had to squelch that reaction when they were partnered with women on a line. That was one of the reasons the SEALs teams didn't allow females. Men got torn between fighting and protecting. Women made brave, good soldiers, but for men, undoing generations of genetic and social hardwiring was a challenge. With difficulty, he shelved that line of thought once more. He scanned the streets and listened for the progress of the men he'd ordered into the surrounding buildings. There wasn't much of Al-Qaeda resistance. Pike had become a lethal force with the machine gun. The dead littered the street. Men, women, and children lay scattered and bloody, some of them missing limbs and unrecognizable from the car damage. The sight sickened Heath, even after everything he'd seen his previous tours. A soldier didn't get used to this. If he was lucky, he developed a means of setting it aside, but it still affected him. A lot of soldiers dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder. Heath had seen a number of those men since his first active tour. As Heath approached the Humvee, Pike clambered down from the vehicle with his M4A1 in one hand. Although Pike was a couple of inches shorter than Heath, his shoulders were broad, and he was more powerfully built. Pike was a guy who couldn't be overlooked when he made himself known. At present, the man looked hard-pressed. His camo was torn and tattered in several places. Blood streaked his stubbled face beneath his non-regulation sunglasses. But he moved like a big cat on the prowl. In his football career, he had seen linebackers who moved like Pike did, hungry, hunting, restless, always in danger because they intuited so much and moved with lightning quickness. Heath nodded to Pike. "You good?" Pike's lips tweaked in a slight smile that never looked quite genuine or at ease. "I am." Once again, Heath wondered at Pike's background. The man never said much about where he'd been and what he'd done before becoming a Marine. Nice work with a 50. "I aim to please." Then Heath's attention centered on Becca as she emerged from the building sporting pocketed walls. A feeling of relief washed page 190 over him, followed immediately by guilt. He shouldn't feel any differently about her than any other Marine, but he did. And he felt differently about her than he did about other female Marines as well. He just didn't know how those feelings were going to shake out. In fact, he wasn't sure how he'd react to them if she knew that they were there. She wouldn't like the confusion inside him at all. Of that he was certain. Beck was almost as disheveled as Pike. In a couple of places her body armor showed through her camo, and he knew she'd taken rounds or gotten hit by shrapnel. "You all right, Corporal?" "I'm fine, sir." Sir. The word defined their relationship at this point in place. He was an officer and she was a non-com. Not only was there not supposed to be any fraternization between male and female Marines, but there wasn't supposed to be any between officers and non-coms. That was two strikes. He looked into her eyes, thinking maybe she wanted him to say something else, but he didn't know what he was supposed to say. He remembered how awkward things had gotten the last time he'd seen her in the park. Her granny had been playing matchmaker, not knowing that was the last thing he and Becca could afford in their military careers. They were in dangerous circumstances. Both of them needed to be focused. Gunny Towers stepped into the awkwardness. He waved over at the Humvee. "Looks like the Tanglers shot the crap out of your vehicle, Corporal Shaw. I count 3 flats, and that surviving tire don't look to be in much better shape." Under the layer of dust that covered Becca's face, she blushed a little and looked uncomfortable. "Actually, Gunny, the Tangles aren't responsible for all that damage. I tossed a grenade under the vehicle." The big sergeant cocked a surprised eyebrow at her. "Nobody told you not to do that?" "The Tangles were using the Humvee as cover. I parked a frag under there to flush them out. I figured the blast plates would save the vehicle." Gunny Towers turned to frown at the dead Al Qaeda warriors around the Humvee. "You probably figured right, Shaw. But the people in the motor pool ain't going to be too happy with you for all the extra work you're throwing their way. Probably not." Towers switched his gaze back over to the street. "Luckily, you ain't going to be having to explain that to any time too soon. We still got a lot of work here to do." In an effort to get the city back to normal more quickly, even though Pike didn't think Kandahar had seen anything close to normal in years, the Marines were tasked with helping watch over the citizens while they took to the streets to claim the bodies of their families and friends. Pike stood guard with Cho, but he couldn't just hang out and watch all those people grieved over their losses. He got bloody helping them gather the bodies and place them in flatbed trucks and pickups that were commandeered by the Afghan National Police. One of the victims had been close to ground zero when an RPG warhead had gone off. The blast had shredded the man's body and torn off his legs and one arm. A young private from back east stared down at the dead man. He spoke in a flat monotone and sounded out of it. "We can rebuild him. We can make him better than he was." Pike looked at the man. "You doing okay, Marine?" Startled, the young private took a step back and looked at Pike. He hadn't known Pike was there. His eyes were red, and Pike suspected that it wasn't just from fatigue and the dust. The guy looked like he was flying on something, wired tight. He shrugged. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You don't sound fine." "It's just this guy." The private jerked his thumb at the dead man. Reminded me of Steve Austin. You know, the $6 million man. Lost both his legs and an arm in a plane crash. Government rebuilt him, made him into a cyborg. Pike vaguely remembered the television show. "Nobody's going to make that man into a cyborg." "Guess not." "You're Hutchinson, right?" The private hesitated, then nodded. "Trevor Hutchinson." "Some advice, Hutchinson." Pike stepped over to the man. Intimidation through proximity. "Maybe you want to chill with the pop culture references around these people and show a little respect." Hutchinson's hand tightened on his assault rifle. "Maybe you want to chill with the advice. I didn't ask for none, and I sure don't need it. You don't need whatever you're flying on either. I catch you using it again while you're on patrol, I'm going to throw you a beat down myself." Heat showed in Hutchinson's face, and for a minute Pike thought the man was going to act rashly. That was fine with Pike. He'd spent the last 3 hours picking up pieces of things that used to be individuals. He could use the distraction. Suddenly, like he'd blown in on a quiet breeze, Gunny Towers was there, looming over them. "Do we have a problem here, Marines?" No, Gunny. Hutchinson looked at the big man. Just looking for pieces. Pike volunteered to get this one. The private turned and walked away. Watching the man go, figuring the last thing Towers needed was to deal with a stone marine in the middle of it, all this carnage, Pike let out his breath, then squatted and took hold of the dead man lying at his feet. He hooked one hand into the man's armpit and fisted his shirt with the other. Even wearing surgical gloves to protect skin-to-skin contact, Pike could feel the coolness of the dead man's flesh. The sensation was alien, wrong. The corpse rolled in his grip, feeling as heavy as wet cement. Towers went to the man's truncated hips, grabbed hold, and lifted. Want to tell me what that was about, Pike? Difference of opinion. Pike walked backwards over the blood-drenched street. What difference? What opinion? It's nothing to cry over. Pike lifted the body out of Towers' grip and stowed that half of him on the truck. Two of the Marines stood on the flatbed and helped shift the bodies that arrived. Didn't look like you were going to cry over nothing. Looked like you were about to stove that guy's head in. Pike didn't bother to deny it. He went back to where they'd collected the corpse and picked up one of the legs. The other leg was 12 feet away. He hadn't found the arm yet. Towers picked up the other leg and followed Pike to the flatbed. Folks deal with this stuff in their own way. Listening but not taking it in, Pike went into his neutral zone, that place he created as a kid to shut down his emotions. Nothing mattered there. Nothing could touch him. He was a rock. This, the private, didn't matter either. I've seen you clean up bodies before, Pike. You never let it bother you. Page 194. Not bother me now, Gunny. That kid's attitude lit you up. Nah, I was just looking for a diversion. My bad. Pike strode over to a woman's body that lay against a delivery van. He knelt down and took her by the shoulder, deliberately not seeing the bloody mess the shrapnel had made of her neck back. If he didn't take those sights in, own them, he didn't have to remember them. He pulled the body away from the vehicle. Underneath the van, a small boy who looked like he was 7 or 8 lay on his side. Blood oozed from a wound in his stomach. Scrapes and bruises on his face, arms, hands were offered mute testimony that he'd gotten beneath the van under his own power. The woman's hands showed the same kind of wear and tear, and Pike suspected that she'd tried to shove the boy underneath the van to protect him. It hadn't done any good. The sadness of the moment stole through Pike's defenses, surprising him. He knew it was because the boy was so close to Hector's age and wore the same innocence on his face. Pike couldn't help thinking that the two boys could have been friends if they'd known each other. Children didn't carry the same kind of baggage adults did, unless their parents forced it on them. And then he couldn't help thinking about Hector, that maybe Hector could be this boy. The part of Tulsa where Hector lived was dangerous too. Step off the wrong street corner at the wrong time, Hector could catch a no-name bullet from a drive-by and end up just as dead. The thought left Pike cold. He didn't want that vision of Hector lying dead on the street mixing with what he was seeing now. That would make it too real, too permanent. There was a reason soldiers kept their lives in battle separate from the world back home. The boy's eyes popped open and looked right at Pike. For the first time, Pike realized that they hadn't been opened the way so many of the dead eyes were. He hadn't even thought about it until he was looking into the boy's eyes. The boy spoke in a thin, dry voice. Pike had just enough of a command of Pashto to understand what the boy was asking for help, for water. Gunny! Pike shoved the dead woman away and scrambled under the van. I need a corpseman over here. This boy's alive. He reached for the boy, managing to shove one hand into the back of the neck and the other his thighs. Gently, Pike began extracting the wounded boy. Towers bawled for a corpseman in his best voice, and the command rang between the buildings. By the time Pike had the boy resting in his arms and was getting to his feet, 2 Navy corpsmen had joined him. Pike looked around and spotted the triage truck that had been set up half a block away. He started walking towards it, holding the boy tightly against his chest, reminding himself again and again that it wasn't Hector, and trying to forget how easily it could have been.